Hi folks, welcome to another For Art's Sake video. It's me again, Carson, but this time we're doing something a little bit different from the last couple of videos. We're doing a Halloween special, two films in one video that are much less weighty than the other films that we've done so far. This is something of a tradition where every Halloween, for its sake, we try to look at a film that isn't necessarily as sobering or takes as much work, I suppose, as the other films. But usually I don't do this screening. I have someone else come in and do it but this time they couldn't make it. And so I'm stuck here and you're stuck with me. Hopefully I can still deliver, although I just could not resist. I still had to choose kind of a weighty film. And that's why I'm actually choosing two films. One is more weighty, it's kind of the more refined intellectual stuff. And then the second one is a lot of fun. It is just so much fun to watch. So the first film is a silent film. It's a Swedish film from 1921 called The Phantom Carriage. Wonderful film. And then the second one is called A Chinese Ghost Story, a film from Hong Kong made in 1987. So these are two films, and I'm going to try and take an academic kind of look at both of them. But the theme, why I chose these two, and what I think links these two, and surprisingly, even though they seem like very different films, I think they are linked by quite a strong common thread, which is the idea of genre. This is what I want to focus on for this talk. Now, briefly before we get into it, I want to define genre briefly. And so, what a genre is simply conventions and expectations. That's what a genre is. Same goes for no matter if you're talking about war movies, rom coms, horror films. Uh, e- each of these genres is simply conventions and expectations. And so conventions are formal conventions set for the narrative form, or the narrative and the form, I should say, so how you tell your story and what images you're creating, what form your film takes. Well, um, these are defined by conventions in certain genres. So, for instance, one convention about a rom-com, for instance, is that you would expect there to be a kiss at some point, right? Surely. So this is a convention that rom-coms will have kisses in the film. On the other hand, there's an expectation to match. Because rom-coms by convention feature kisses, uh, if you are a member of an audience of a rom-com, then you would expect there to be a kiss. And so this is true of, generally speaking, film genres, and this is how they work. And so genres have marketing, and so this marketing communicates the genre to an audience. And so a spectator, when they go to see a film, well, if that film is advertised as a romance movie, or if it's advertised as a war movie, they have a certain set of expectations that they link to that genre. And then when they come into it and those expectations, if they aren't met, in other words, if that film doesn't employ the conventions of that genre to match those expectations, well, the audience feels unsatisfied. And that's actually where kind of the feeling of dissatisfaction or not liking a film often comes from, this mismatch between the conventions or what form is being used in the film, the conventions of a genre, and then the expectations of the audience. Uh, Typically, to gain the approval of an audience, a film, especially a Hollywood film, will follow most of those conventions. They will follow the conventions very closely, and we call these films genre films because they fit in the genre really well because they're using all those conventions in the film. These genre films are can also be said to be very generic in the sense that we're using the word generic to mean being of a genre. But at the same time, even the normal parlance use of the word generic actually fits with the idea of, or the scholarly idea of what a genre is very well. Because if you think about it, well, if I were to say that, oh, I went to see that new action movie, it's just generic. It's just generic trash. What do I mean by that? Well, that criticism of me saying that it's just generic trash, or however you want to say, uh, that actually what I'm trying to say is that it didn't stand out, right? It didn't really strike me as unique. And why did it not strike me as unique? Well, because it was like every other action movie, or or if it's a romance, it's like every other romance movie. How is it like every other romance movie? Because it fits the conventions of the genre too closely in those cases, right? When people start to become irked by how generic it is, it may be it is following the conventions a little bit too closely, and it's not really adding anything else. Um, so in that sense, that's actually where you get the sense that something is generic from. It follows genre conventions. So with that, I want to delve into then the genre of horror. Let's think about what the horror genre is. And one person who did a lot of thinking about that is Linda Williams, a scholar who writes mostly about sex in cinema and pornography. She's really, I think it's fair to say, the leading scholar on pornography. But she wrote this influential article, Film Bodies, Gender, Genre, and Excess, that in it she argues that we can conceptualize, in particular, three different genres to be what she calls body genres, and that these are not talking. The argument is basically that these are films that don't talk to the brain; they talk to your body, right? They don't really make an intellectual appeal; they make an appeal directly to the five senses. And they do this by using kind of excess and spectacle as their key tool. And the three that she looks at in particular is pornography, horror, and melodrama. And so I'm going to read just the first few pages of her influential article to give, her argument about how the horror genre really works in Hollywood. So this is Film Bodies, Gender, Genre, and Excess. When my 7-year-old son and I go to the movies, we often select from among categories of films that promise to be sensational, to give our bodies an actual physical jolt. He calls these movies gross. My son and I agree that the fun of gross movies is in their display of sensations that are on the edge of respectable. Where we disagree, and where we as a culture often disagree, along lines of gender, age, or sexual orientation, is in which movies are over the edge, too gross. To my son, the good gross movies are those with scary monsters like Freddy Krueger of the Nightmare on Elm Street series, who rip apart teenagers, especially teenage girls. These movies both fascinate and scare him. He is actually more interested in talking about than seeing them. A second category, one that I like and my son doesn't, are sad movies that make you cry. These are gross in their focus on unseemly emotions that may remind him too acutely of his own powerlessness as a child. A third category of both intense interest and disgust to my son, he makes the puke sign when speaking of it. He can only describe it euphemistically as the K word. K is for kissing. To a 7-year-old boy, it is kissing precisely, which is obscene. There is no accounting for taste, especially in the realm of the gross. As a culture, we most often invoke the term to designate excesses which we wish to exclude. To say, for example, which of the Robert Mapplethorpe photos we draw the line at, but not to say what form and structure and function operate within the representations deemed excessive. Because so much attention goes to determining where to draw the line, discussions of the gross are often a highly confused hodgepodge of different categories of excess. For example, pornography is today more often deemed excessive for its violence than for its sex, while horror films are excessive in their displacement of sex onto violence. In contrast, melodramas are deemed excessive for their gender and sex-linked pathos, for their naked displays of emotion. And Douglas once referred to the genre of romance fiction as softcore emotional porn for women. Alone or in combination, heavy doses of sex, violence, and emotion are dismissed by one faction or another as having no logic or reason for existence beyond their power to excite. Gratuitous sex, gratuitous violence and terror, gratuitous emotion are frequent epithets hurled at the phenomenon of the sensational in pornography, horror, and melodrama. This essay explores the notion that there may be some value in thinking about the form, function, and system of seemingly gratuitous excesses in these three genres. For if, as it seems, sex, violence, and emotion are fundamental elements of the sensational effects of these three types of films, the designation gratuitous is itself gratuitous. My hope, therefore, is that by thinking comparatively about all three gross and sensational film body genres, we might be able to get beyond the mere fact of sensation to explore its system and structure, as well as its effect on the bodies of spectators. Body genres. The repetitive formulas and spectacles of film genres are often defined by their differences from the classical realist style of narrative cinema. These classical films have been characterized as efficient, action-centered, goal-oriented, linear narratives driven by the desire of a single protagonist, involving one or two lines of action and leading to a definitive closure. In their influential study of the classical Hollywood cinema, Bordwell, Thompson, and Steiger call this the classical Hollywood style. As Rick Altman has noted in a recent article, both genre study and the study of assumptions about the classical nature of the dominant narrative, to which melodrama and some individual genres. Oh, sorry, I skipped a line. As Rick Altman has noted in a recent article, both genre study and the study of the somewhat more nebulous category of melodrama has long been hampered by assumptions about the classical nature of the dominant narrative to which melodrama and some individual genres have been opposed. Altman argues that Bordwell, Thompson, and Steiger, who locates the classical Hollywood style in the linear, progressive form of the Hollywood narrative, cannot accommodate melodramatic attributes like spectacle, episodic presentation, or dependence on coincidence, except as limited exceptions or play within the dominant linear causality of the classical. Altman writes, unmotivated events, rhythmic montage, highlighted parallelism, overlong spectacles. These are the excesses in the classical narrative system that alert us to the existence of a competing logic, a second voice. Altman, whose own work on the movie musical has necessarily relied upon analyses of seemingly excessive spectacles and parallel constructions, thus makes a strong case for the need to recognize the possibility that excess may itself be organized as a system. Yet analyses of systems of excess have been much slower to emerge in the genres whose nonlinear spectacles have centered more directly upon the gross display of the human body. Pornography and horror films are two such systems of excess. Pornography is the lowest in cultural esteem. Gross out horror is next to lowest. So, I think that's more or less clear, and so basically that she's saying that the thing about body genres, pornography, horror, and melodrama, is that just that they speak to the senses and not necessarily just to the mind, but they use senses as their key method of representation. That their whole ploy, their whole tactic is to use spectacle, is to use what is seemingly excessive or gratuitous, and that's how they work. People are coming here and they are interested and excited by these films because they are frightening or they are excessive, right? Excess is why we come to see these films. So let's consider a film that appears to be horror, but it isn't horror because it doesn't follow any of these body genres or these, things that typify a body genre. And that's The Phantom Carriage from 1921, directed by Victor Shostrom. So this is a Swedish film. And first, I want to give a little bit of historical background. I'm going to take from a book written by really the preeminent American film scholars of our times. In fact, they were referenced in body genres, David Bordwell and Kristen Thompson, and they wrote what is really effectively the the definitive introductory handbook to film history, or introductory textbook, I should say. So this is a very simple textbook aimed at just beginners, but I think they give a very brief, very concise and clear, much more concise and clear than I can give, introduction on the Scandinavian cinema during during the silent era, during the 1910s, and also the role of Victor Shostrom and the film Phantom Carriage in it. So I'm going to be reading a small, excuse me, excerpt from their textbook on Scandinavian cinema. And so I'll say first, I'm going to skip to the part about Sweden. And so I'm going to say that basically they say that Scandinavian cinema was really a juggernaut, or a major player during the 1910s. During this time, Hollywood was still developing, and then French cinema was a very early player. But Denmark actually came in really early on and established a Scandinavian film industry super early on in film history with the film studio Nordisk. And so I'll pick up the story in 1912 in Sweden. In 1912, Sweden suddenly began producing a string of innovative films. Most of these were made by only three directors: George af Klerker, Marit Stiller, and Victor Shostrom. The Swedish cinema initially had little impact abroad, and so its filmmakers were working without the larger budgets made possible by export. Sweden was among the first countries to create a major cinema by drawing deliberately on the particular traits of its national culture. Swedish films are characterized by their dependence on northern landscapes and by their use of local literature, costumes, customs, and the like. After the war's end, their specifically Swedish qualities made these films novel and popular in other countries. The success of Nordisk in Denmark had been one inspiration for the formation of a small Swedish firm, the Svenska Biografteatern, in 1907. It would eventually form the basis of the leading Swedish film firm, still in existence today. Located in the small provincial city of Kristianstad, Svenska was initially a theater chain. In 1909, Charles Magnusson took over its management and built it into the country's main production company. So I'm going to skip down a little bit now and go to the section that talks about Victor Shostrom. So Victor Shostrom was one of the most important directors of the entire silent era. His style was austere and naturalistic. He used restrained acting and staged scenes in considerable depth, both in location shots and in sets. His narratives frequently trace in great detail the grim consequences of a single action. So I'm going to skip again, actually, and go down to where we talk about the Phantom Carriage. Okay. So basically, to summarize until now, so Shostrom was making films for Svenska, which Svenska would later merge with some other companies to become Svensk Film Industry, which was it continues to be actually to this day, the leading film studio in Sweden. And during this time, Swedish cinema became an international export and very popular internationally, especially on the popularity of Sjostrom's films themselves. And so this culminates with the Phantom Carriage. So even more successful was Sjostrom's 1920 film, The Phantom Chariot, another name for the Phantom Carriage. Adapted again from Lagerlöf, which is a Swedish writer who wrote the source material for this film. It uses remarkably complex means to tell the story of a drunken lout who nearly dies in a cemetery at midnight on New Year's Eve. He is given a chance to ride a ghostly carriage driven by death and witness how his behavior has ruined the lives of two women who love him. The ghostly superimpositions, accomplished entirely in the camera during filming, were some of the most elaborate yet attempted. Similarly, the Phantom Chariot's story was told in an intricately interwoven set of flashbacks that became highly influential in European cinema of the 1920s. Ironically, the very success of the Swedish cinema abroad contributed to its decline. After about 1920, Svenska concentrated on expensive prestige pictures designed for export. Only a few of these, like the story of Gosta Berling, were artistic successes. Showstrom's and Stiller's growing reputations led Hollywood firms to lure them away from svensk film industry. Moreover, other countries were entering the international marketplace, and the small Swedish cinema could not compete. After 1921, film production in Sweden plummeted. So this film coming out in 1920/1921, you're always going to get disagreement on the exact date that a film came out, but this was kind of the culmination of Swedish cinema in some ways. This is a really well-known film, probably the most well-known Swedish, if not the most well-known Scandinavian silent film, period. And it was kind of a culmination, but also a death knell, because Victor Shostrom would move to Hollywood and start directing films there. But nonetheless, let's take a look at this film. And so this is and I want to ask the question, is this really a horror film? Because this film has zero jump scares. Well, I should say first, this is way before the modern genre of horror was actually formulated and developed, but there's zero jump scares. It is a very creepy film, and as Borwell mentioned, the story is talking about death riding a carriage. So it's a creepy film, but the end result is that you probably won't get scared at all. It is creepy, but it's not at all frightening. And instead, at some parts, it's suspenseful, but in the end, what you'll probably end up doing watching this film is crying. In fact, the genre that's closest to is melodrama, because it really is a tearjerker. And so this is a shot that shows when basically the legend of this Phantom Carriage is being told. So here the figure in the middle is talking about how every New Year's Eve, Death is going to drive a chariot around and find the first person to die on exactly midnight on New Year's Eve, and they're going to have to replace the chariot driver. And so we see then, as he's telling the story, an image of the chariot actually driving. And this is an example of that something that this film is really renowned for, this incredibly complex, elaborate use of practical effects to create this ghostly apparition look. The effect is called double exposure. So how it works is that there's a film strip, and on the top there's the emulsion, which is chemicals. And what happens is that the lens lets in some light, and that light burns the chemicals. There's a chemical reaction, and the chemicals will change color based on the light. It'll react to the light. And so what happens then is that you take the film strip and you only open the lens very briefly. You capture the first image, and then you close the shutter again, and you go to a complete different image and you open it again, and thus you've kind of superimposed two different images on the same strip of film. So that's how this works. They went and captured this landscape first, and then they captured the carriage and on the same strip of film. And you can also see how Borwell was talking about how it uses landscapes. You see that a very well shot landscape is used here. And also it is, looks quite Nordic, and it's also in very sharp focus. That is a conscious decision, and not actually an easy one to make, especially in these early days of cinema. Victor Shostrom would have had to make sure that everything stayed in sharp focus, because you can see that the rocks in the foreground are in sharp focus, and then the background, those trees in the far background, they're in pretty sharp focus too. You would need to select a specific lens to be able to do that, to calibrate it correctly. So that is a conscious decision to keep everything in sharp focus. So let's look at some of the horror conventions that this film does follow, right? You can see that this is in a graveyard. And so here is the main character, who's also played by Victor Shostrom, his spirit is rising out of his body when he's kind of collapsed drunk on New Year's Eve. And you can see this is an incredibly creepy moment where this ghostly apparition is rising out of his body in a graveyard, profoundly creepy. And then we see it appearing in the graveyard, death, driving a carriage with the scythe over his shoulder and in this graveyard. This is clearly, when you look at this image alone, you're probably going to think that, oh, clearly this film is a horror film, and it looks so profoundly horror film. And then and this shot as well. However, at the same time, this is by no means a genre film. It is closest to melodrama, but I would say that it actually is closer to art cinema, which art cinema, importantly, specifically eschews the idea of genre films. It doesn't like to, art cinema as a mode is all about not boxing films into one genre or another, but rather opening up to where art cinema really believes in a kind of auteurism, where the director is an artist, and they are supposed to be the sole artist. And it's not necessarily fitting one genre or another that is a point of art cinema. It is a point of the point of art cinema is kind of to have the director express their own personal vision, whatever that may be. And in this case, I think this film really deserves fits more so in art cinema because everywhere you read a director's personal vision. So you saw those hallmarks of Victor Shostrom discussed in Boardwell, which is those sharp focus, using lots of landscapes. And here we see incredibly dramatic lighting. This is by no means typical lighting, not the typical lighting that you see in Hollywood. Even at this early time, even in 1920, Hollywood have developed a very sophisticated style of lighting that was supposed to be consistent. It was always supposed to be clear. It's called three-point lighting. This does not use three-point lighting. In fact, this is basically the exact opposite, where there's really only one extremely bright light source used, and it creates an effect which is known throughout the visual arts as chiaroscuro. So chiaroscuro is basically, it's an Italian term, which basically describes the extreme contrast between light and dark. So you can see this part of Death's face is in a bright light, very brightly lit, but it very quickly goes into an extremely dark, like completely shrouded in darkness. And this is such a dramatic effect. It is expressionistic. And it's not really natural. It doesn't look clear. It's not. So Hollywood three-point lighting is all about you can always see as much information as possible. This purposely obscures information. And so this denies Hollywood, but this film also denies a lot of conventions. And it's so, for instance, with melodrama, most of the film, or a lot of the film, for instance, goes with horror, whoops, let me skip a little bit more. So here we even get moments of great suspense. There's a lot of tragedy, which is common with melodrama, but it suffices to say that it does not. This is not a film that follows the common strictures of any particular genre. So for instance, in melodrama is known for having a lot of weeping. There is weeping. There's a particular melodramatic scene at the end, which we'll actually get to. But in this case, the film is much more about a complex narrative structure that isn't really seen, a complex and nuanced narrative structure and narrative that isn't really seen in melodrama, which is a straightforward focused on pain and tragedy and weeping. And this, I think, is no coincidence, or it creates no coincidence for the fact that this film has been extremely influential in the world of art cinema. In fact, the quintessential art cinema filmmaker, Ingmar Bergman, in one of his quintessential films, Wild Strawberries, cast Victor Shostrom as the lead in this film out of both admiration for the director and admiration, certainly, for this film. In fact, the Phantom Carriage is all about being in these flashbacks, being in kind of with a flashback within a flashback. Wild Strawberries is similarly all about flashbacks, um, or flashbacks form a major part of the film. So, but interesting enough, this non-horror horror film, or shall we say non-horror art film or non-horror melodrama, also had a huge impact on horror. One of the quintessential horror films, one of the definitive horror films, is, of course, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. And Kubrick took particular note of this film and basically quoted a scene, which you see here. I don't think I even need to show you the famous here's Johnny axe chopping on a door scene in The Shining, but you can see it's actually a quotation from the Phantom Carriage, and it's done very, very similar way in terms of how the editing and the shots. But at the end of the day, this is still a work that isn't really a genre film. It's not generic at all. It is the work, clearly the work of a personal directorial vision. And that is kind of a hallmark way that you can tell it's not a genre film. You can see that this very powerful landscape shot here, a wide shot. We get a beautiful view of a Nordic landscape. And again, we have the typical very strong, a very, very clearly expressive, right? Not a clear kind of, so genre films are all about, you either have efficient storytelling, efficient action-centered storytelling, or you're going to have the excess. Well, this is not efficient storytelling because it is taking, it is going above and beyond, kind of, right? There's no, if this was efficient storytelling, then we would not be seeing this from a wide shot. We'd be getting close up of seeing what exactly is happening. So I should say, actually, the man in the middle of this shot is the main character. And so if this was Hollywood style efficient storytelling, we would have gotten a close up to see what he was doing. But we don't, and we get this wide landscape because it's interested not in efficient storytelling, not just in efficient storytelling, I should say. This film is very, very efficiently told story-wise as well, but it's also about kind of visual pleasure and a directorial mark, which is that just like in that previous shot of death, well, we see that there's a very strong contrast between the extreme darkness of the foreground and then the extreme brightness of the lake. So that same kind of chiaroscuro. So there is actually directorial hallmark, a part evidence of a kind of directorial vision. So yes, in the end of the day, this is a film that is not a genre film, and yet both influenced horror very strongly and has some horror conventions. And then, so we can kind of think of it as an expanded definition of horror, a different kind of horror film that isn't a horror film. And we see here that this is the final shot of the film. It is a weepy. You'll be crying at the end. This is a film full of pathos. So the second film is a Chinese ghost story from 1987. The credited director is Ching Siu-tung, but it's widely believed that the credited producer was the effective director, and that's Choi Hak. Again, credited as a producer, but widely believed to be the true director. And this film is a really, really important film in terms of the development of Hong Kong cinema. And I want to show just here the title card of the film, because Choi Hak is kind of famous for, well, he's famous for a lot of things, but he has a really great talent for visual flair, and so his title cards really show this. And it is just an amazing to look at. It is very striking. But also on this title card is a Chinese title, 倩女幽魂, which translates roughly to beautiful woman ghost, beautiful woman ghost, basically. But it's also wordplay because the main female character her name is Nie Xiaoqian, and the last character's name is Tian. And the title, the first character of the title is also Tian, and it's the same character. So it's kind of a wordplay that Tian also happens to mean beautiful woman. And so beautiful woman ghost, but also part of her name. And the name of the beautiful woman, beautiful woman ghost herself. So first, just like for the other film, I want to give first a historical overview about the background on this film. And I'm again going to turn to David Borwell, who wrote probably the most well-known monograph on Hong Kong cinema, talking about the history of Hong Kong cinema and its form. And in this book, the cinema of the 1980s, the Hong Kong cinema of the 1980s, was when there was a looming knowledge of that there was going to be a transfer of Hong Kong, a return to China. Hong Kong, of course, was at that time a British colony, and they had signed an agreement to return the colony to China and end 140 some years of British rule. But this was many Hong Kongers felt that this was a threat to their culture. And there was an overall sense of not quite dread, but uncertainty, deep uncertainty. And so during this time, they were afraid that returning to China, because over the 140 years of British rule, they had developed their own political system, their own economic system, their own very unique culture. But they were afraid that that culture would be gone, and Hong Kong would kind of just be absorbed into China. But so what we saw in the 80s, the handover was scheduled for 1997. The agreement was signed in the 80s, but so from the agreement signing to the actual handover date in 1997, we saw in Hong Kong culture a great move to try and define a local culture. Beforehand, there was a Hong Kong local culture. There was a distinctive Hong Kong local culture, but it really wasn't unified. So the locality or the strength of the Hong Kong local identity was more or less a myth. It didn't really exist. It existed, but it was still iffy. It was still clearly tied to mainland China. But in the 1980s, anticipating this handover, there was a really strong movement to try and create a new Hong Kong culture. And in cinema, we saw a Hong Kong new wave in the 80s, where they tried to create a very distinctive, uniquely Hong Kong style. And one director who was working on this at the time, David Borwell, quotes him as saying that the style of Hong Kong cinema that developed at this time, the director's name is Peter Chan, he says that this style was more Hollywood than Hollywood. And what he means is that these are films that are shot in ways that are even more fast-paced than, so Hong Kong's action films would be even more fast-paced than Hollywood's action films. The comedies would be crazier than Hollywood's comedies. They would be more out there. And so everything kind of became accelerated and accentuated and to a point of excess. Hong Kong cinema was not afraid to use excess and spectacle. What does that sound like? It sounds like horror films, right? The body genres that use excess and spectacle. In particular, Choi Hak, the effective director of A Chinese Ghost Story, was a key figure, really probably the most central figure in organizing this Hong Kong new wave. And David Bordwell writes on Choi Hak, and I think he gives a very good introduction or a very good overview of exactly who is Choi Hak, how is he understood in the by film scholars, and kind of what is his reputation. But he is definitely one of the most revered and one would say controversial filmmakers of the Hong Kong New Wave. So I'll read a bit from Planet Hong Kong. A Chinese feast, Choi Hak. In a cement block complex smelling of deep frying and cigarette smoke, Film Workshop has its quarters. The offices are spacious but Spartan. No mahogany executive suites, no plush screening rooms. One room is all gray cubicles. In a large loft next door, several young men, surrounded by post-its and pinned up character drawings, hunch over computers, tweaking the animated feature A Chinese Ghost Story. The flashiest spot is the reception area, with its gleaming film workshop logo, a blow-up from Once Upon a Time in China, and a cartoon mural of the workshop staff, with its leader sitting at the center, frowning behind dark glasses and a long cigar. Choi Hak moves swiftly from meeting to meeting before settling down for an interview. He is slender, with glowing eyes, a famous goatee, and a forbidding demeanor. He gives the impression of a coiled spring. This is the man who can shoot for 36 hours straight, who can cut, dub, mix, subtitle, and print a film in 5 days and still be making small revisions 4 hours before a midnight show. He responds to questions courteously and at length, but seldom directly. Thoughts spin off in a dozen directions. Choi is an intense talker who conveys both the pragmatism of a producer and the energy of a director. There are two versions of what happened to Hong Kong film during the 1980s, and he is central to both. In the optimistic version, Choi was the key innovator and modernizer. His first feature, The Butterfly Murders, 1979, was a revisionist martial arts film. We're Going to Eat You, 1980, brought something of the wildness of 1970s American exploitation to a tale of cannibalism. And even the censored version of Dangerous Encounter, First Kind, 1980, offered blistering criticism of social inequities in the colony. According to Lee Chok-to, All the Wrong Clues for the Right Solution, 1981, made modern, streamlined comedies about high life a staple of the Hong Kong cinema. Zoo, Warriors from the Magic Mountain, 1983, brought Hollywood special effects to a quasi-mystical swordplay fantasy. After forming his independent company Film Workshop, Choi launched a firecracker string of films that were frantic, colorful, and triumphantly new. As producer and director, he pioneered historic gunplay, A Better Tomorrow, 1986, historical adventure, Peking Opera Blues, 1986, Gunmen, 1988, The Raid, 1991, and futuristic fantasy, RoboForce, 1988, Wicked City, 1992. He revived and updated the Shanghai comedy, the ghost romance, the swordplay fantasy, and kung fu drama. In 1997, he remade A Chinese Ghost Story as an animated feature. Choi consolidated the slick look and the vulgar, freewheeling imagination that became the hallmarks of Hong Kong cinema for world film culture. From Film Workshop came bloodbaths of male honor and sacrifice, kung fu duels on flaming posts and oil-slicked floors, cross-dressing sword fighters and bisexual lords of the underworld, giant tongues and rampaging oversized clocks and shotgun-blasting women in trench coats, all the outrageous splendors that regaled Western fans and, on many occasions, won big box office throughout East Asia. By this reckoning, Choi has been the most far-sighted creative force of the past 20 years. According to the other version of 1980s history, Choi epitomizes the lost promise of the new wave. His first three films flung down challenges to mainstream cinema, but all were box office disasters. So the story goes, Choi lost interest in social provocation and channeled his volcanic energy into noisy, lowbrow entertainment. He recycled old movies, entire genres, while shamelessly copying Hollywood trends. Not for nothing is he called the Steven Spielberg of Hong Kong. Worse, say his critics, having created Film Workshop as a haven for independence, he turned into a meddlesome producer. He recut John Woo's A Better Tomorrow and took over Yim Ho's King of Chess. Some say he tried to overhaul The Killer. Ching Siu-tung was credited as director of A Chinese Ghost Story, but Choi shot and edited many of the dramatic scenes. He arranged for King Hu's comeback project, The Swordsman, but the two disagreed so strongly that Hu left the production. In this version of history, Choi pulled the new wave into the mainstream, dumbing down local cinema and leaving no niche for personal filmmaking. Ambitious directors stifled their own inclinations and obediently stamped out Choi Hak product. No surprise that he would keep trying to make movies in Hollywood, from The Master, belatedly released in 1992, to Double Team, 1997, and Knockoff, 1998. So that's Troy Hawk. But I think one thing you can tell, regardless of people's opinion on where he stands in film history, is that he has such an undeniably strong style. I mean, you heard about how cross-dressing warriors and women in trench coats with shotguns, this is his style, which is absolutely amazing. What you'll see in A Chinese Ghost Story is incredibly fast cuts, so much fun. It just comes blaring at you, the spectacle, the excess. There are some shots that are less than half a second long. Half a second long. In fact, many films that Troy produced or directed would have an average shot length of less than 3 seconds long. Average. These shots are insanely short, and it just goes fast. It goes incredibly fast and hits you in the face. There's action, there's explosions, there's magic, and the form. What is so amazing is the incredible form that he uses to make this happen. Part of it is that incredibly fast editing. And then also you see in this shot from A Chinese Ghost Story, there are a couple different things. First of all, he uses a very, very strange lens. And this is kind of common across Hong Kong cinema of this era, and especially Troy Hawk, that this lens is very strange because you see an extreme close-up of a very extreme angle on the man in the foreground, but in the background you see a wide. And so this juxtaposition of a very, very close-up of the face of the guy in the front versus quite a wide shot of the guy in the background, and then they're in the same shot, they're juxtaposed so close. This is really strange. And if you think like the angle of it, right? The camera is clearly incredibly close, unusually close to the man in the foreground. And so that character, it's also really close to the arrow. And so you get a really sense of velocity. And this is an unusual camera placement and an unusual camera angle that you'll see across the film. Troy uses many high and low angles that you really do not see typically. And then also the lighting. Troy is always using incredibly strong lighting and incredibly expressive lighting, in the sense that this is kind of purposefully unrealistic in a sense. So many of his films feature just light streaming across the room, incredibly bright lights juxtaposed with incredible darkness. There's always kind of rays of sunshine or rays of light coming left and right, giving you a sense of velocity through the scene and drawing lines across the frame. So you do get this in this shot as well. But again, what we're interested in is genre. This film is absolutely a horror film. Unlike the Phantom Carriage, this checks all the boxes. This is absolutely a full-on body genre horror film. But at the same time, it's not. So let's consider what typically happens when you are given the task of making a genre film, but you don't want to. This kind of problem, so let's say you're an art filmmaker. You want to give your personal vision, but you're working in Hollywood and you're forced to make a genre film. And this kind of problem was looked at by the scholar John G. Kowalty in a very landmark article, Chinatown and Generic Transformation of Recent American Films. And he calls this generic transformation. So they're taking, I'll say what generic transformation is first. So basically what filmmakers did, and he was looking at films made in the 1960s through the early 1970s, what is often called New Hollywood, or the Hollywood, or the American New Wave, I should say. And one prime example that he cites is Chinatown. So Chinatown is a neo-noir. The idea was that this film should be a genre film that fits squarely in the noir genre. But the director was a European modernist new wave filmmaker, and he very personal filmmaker that made art films back in Europe. He didn't want to make a genre film. So what happened is that through the form and the narrative, it kind of goes through and debunks noirs. That each part of a noir that you would expect to be there, it doesn't gratify you. It purposefully fails it purposely advertises itself the wrong way. And so what Kowalski says is that this is a key and very interesting way that you can mess around with genres by taking a genre, making it look incredibly like one genre, and then transforming it midway through. So, for instance, in Chinatown, everyone wears noir-style clothing. There's noir-style music. Clearly, the filmmakers bent over backwards to make it look noir. But then key areas where noirs should have certain things, right? So the femme fatales, and the hard-boiled detective. Well, the detective looks hard-boiled at first, but then he starts failing, and we end up finding he ends up getting lost, and he ends up basically how the film works narratively is that he begins with this sharp, hard-boiled detective image, but then by the point that we're in the second half of the film, he's been beaten up. The first half of the film, he's in this great, suit and this fedora. Second half of the film, well, he's still in a suit and a fedora, but he's got this big bandage on his face. And so it shows the weakness of that. And so it kind of debases the genre that it claims to be. And it's kind of purposefully being unsatisfactory. It purposely bucks the conventions and then makes you think that it's going to fit all those expectations of a genre, and then it doesn't. I'm trying not to spoil anything about Chinatown, but anyway, that's the way that Kowalski says. And so kind of you can see it as kind of doing a similar thing with art films and Phantom Carriage, where if you were to think that Phantom Carriage is a straightforward horror film, you would be disappointed. And so the reason why is that it refuses to follow any of the conventions of a particular genre. And similarly, this is about how Kowalski's generic transformation is basically, it claims to be one genre, but just like Phantom Carriage and art films in general, it refuses to follow those. And so it kind of is deceptively advertised. Well, what's interesting is, so, okay, that is one method. But I wanted to bring up this method to bring up how I think a Chinese ghost story does it, which is, if this is one method of debasing it, and this Kowalski saw this as like the quintessential way you debase genre, and this is generic transformation is the tool that filmmakers use to debase genre. Well, what if I told you that there's another way that you can do the same debasement of genres without any generic transformation at all? What if I said that there was a way that you could have the best of both worlds? And the way that you can debase genre is by just being the genre. So this is what a Chinese ghost story does. A Chinese ghost story goes from genre to genre and checks all the boxes. It gives you everything you'd want. If you're in for a horror film, it has every convention of a horror film that you could desire. But it doesn't just give you that. Instead, it more than delivers. It over delivers. And it's I see it as a kind of postmodern take on generic transformation. And how it does it is that it absolutely over delivers with a genre. It is absolutely genre film. Because it follows every single convention of a horror film, but it also follows every convention of a romance film, and a musical, and a comedy, and an action film. Let me show you. Let's count how many genres you could describe a Chinese ghost story as. First, horror. Look at this image. Clearly horror. And this is basically a jump scare. There's actually several jump scares in the film. And so it checks every single box of a horror film, and that there's even moments where it takes a page from Jaws, where the beginning of the film you see this monster creeping up to prey on a guy, and you never see the monster, right? The kind of Jaws horror that has become a key part of the horror genre. You get jump scares, you get that kind of you never see the monster. You even get attractive teens who are naive. The man who's lying down here is Leslie Chung, who was a famously attractive male star, and he's playing this kind of young, naive character who falls into these horror traps. Right, all these tropes, all of these conventions, they're all met. So it is clearly horror, right? You can see this image is really creepy horror image, and it's not like Phantom Carriage where it's just creepy. It's actually there's jump scares, and there's the attractive teens that fall into the traps. All of those conventions are met. And number two, comedy. So here's a gag where Leslie Chung's character at the beginning of the film opens an umbrella, but the umbrella is full of holes and the rain comes down anyway. So it's a gag, but there's actually a whole bunch of gags, and there's whole scenes dedicated to just comedy. So you think, okay, horror movie, but then in a completely separate area, there's scenes that are only comedy. And then what's more is that Leslie Chung's character is not just the attractive teen, he's also a screwball, i.e., one of the quintessential comedy characters. He bumbles around, he bumps into people, he kind of clumsily stumbles around. And so he is a very generic comedy character. And there's a bunch of comedy in the film. It is genuinely a funny, laugh out loud film. Number three, musical. There are actually two musical numbers of the film. And in this moment, it is literally exactly halfway through the film. And this character, who is a Taoist warrior monk, breaks into song. And you see also some of the Troy Hart's really striking lighting here as well. But basically, he breaks into song and he literally dances along with the song. But in the narrative, the motivation for this is that it's not a song and dance. He's actually practicing his warrior moves. And he's casting magical spells, and he's doing a sword play. He's practicing a sword play. But this is a musical number. It just stops the narrative halfway through the film. The narrative just completely stops, and we get a complete excess musical number. And then also in the beginning of the film, there's no dancing, but similarly, we kind of get basically music video. Whereas the credits roll, the opening credits, we get a song that is actually sung by Leslie Chung himself, the male lead of the film. He was also a pop singer. So we get a song sung by him, put against him walking through the rain, and it's effectively a music video. So we get two music numbers with singing, and in this case, the guy is actually singing in the film, diegetically in character, and there's dancing. So musical is number three. Number four, romance. Just like how there's whole scenes set aside where there's no jump scares, it is just pure for comedy. There's whole scenes set aside where there's no comedy and there's no jump scares. It is just pure romance. There's quite a few erotic scenes. It is really steamy. And then there's this woman, and it is the female lead, and the female main character, the male main character, they have kind of a Romeo and Juliet thing going where they're not allowed to be together, but they find every chance to be together, and we get this whole romantic arc. But unlike Hollywood films where the arc is kind of efficiently tucked into the main story, it's disparate. In fact, every one of the genres is disparate. There are scenes set aside only for romance, scenes set aside only for comedy. And then finally, number five, action. Or specifically, it's it's a genre, a specific genre that is unique to China called wuxia. And wuxia is basically a kind of action martial arts cinema where there is a lot of acrobatics. Is very operatic, where it's kind of a choreographed acrobatic dance almost. And there's a lot of kind of like flying around, jumping around, and it's focused on sword play as well, and sometimes also magic. And so there's people are kind of casting magical spells, and there's huge, elaborate swordplay fights complete with like acrobatics, unbelievably profound, or not profound, but unbelievably huge displays of swordplay. They're fighting, through the air, and they're leaping around, and then they're casting spells at each other. It is total martial arts. It is a tour de force of martial arts cinema. In fact, this film is considered, even though it is a horror, comedy, romance, musical, it also happens to be considered one of the key films in the development of martial arts cinema. Specifically, it helped to usher in this so-called new wuxia style, which is much more frenetic than the older wuxia films. I won't get much into the details about that, but basically, the wuxia is, again, its own discrete component of the film. So it's five genres. It's not like generic transformation, because they still follow the conventions of every single one. It delivers. So if you are coming here to watch a horror film, it delivers. You get everything that you would expect in a horror film, but you get more. If you came to watch a comedy film, you get a funny movie and all the conventions of a comedy film, but you get more. Same thing with wuxia, you get more. And it's even different from Hollywood mashups of genres, like, for instance, the rom-com between romance and comedy, because the rom-com is not, the way that they mash up those two genres is to mix them, right? Not to keep them discrete. In other words, how the rom-com works is it takes some conventions from romance, it takes some conventions from comedy, add in a few unique conventions, and then they basically make a complete different genre. It is not all of romance and all of comedy just put into just kind of in discrete parts, just mashed together. They actually kind of pick and create a new genre. In this case, it is actually every single part of all five of those genres mashed together. And in fact, even kept discreet. And in that way, it kind of undermines the horror genre by, it still gives you everything that you want, but it is a kind of different generic transformation, where generic transformation is kind of debasing genre by not being genre, by kind of like claiming to be in the middle, but going down. This is kind of claiming to be genre, or so if we were thinking like genre and then art film, right? Like, it's claiming to be genre, but goes down to art film in reality. This is claiming to be genre, but then it kind of goes up, which is like ultra genre. And it effectively is generic transformation, because it, in some ways, it's even more effective than generic transformation, because it transforms genre into something that cannot be a genre. You can still classify art films as art films. You could even see that as kind of a genre. Or, well, it really is a mode, but you get my point there, that you can kind of consider them all as drama, right? In this case, there is no genre. It's impossible, because of the way that it uses every single genre. You can't claim that it's any one genre. And the idea of even trying to use genre no longer makes sense. And that is, I think, genius in many ways. And it debases also that it is openly body genre. So it is openly erotic in those romance scenes. It is openly, and it openly uses jump scares, which is also, part of how the body genre of horror materializes. But what's really interesting is that in the narrative of the film, and also in the style, it directly addresses the idea of the body. And so spectacle, as Linda Williams says, is tied to body. And this film is actually about body. It actually interacts, interestingly, in a really profound and deep way with bodies. So let's consider that real quick. Here is the actual beginning of the film, and so first we see this scholar, this male scholar, just minding his own business. And then he looks up, he feels a breeze, and he looks up and he sees before him as materialized out of nowhere, out of thin air, a beautiful woman, an incredibly beautiful woman. And she beckons him forward. She tosses him part of her clothes, and she pulls him in. And then something that is like blatantly erotic, blatantly sexual encounter. They're about to consummate this romance, this sudden erotic encounter, and then suddenly there's a monster. Turns out that woman is a ghost, and she is serving this demon. She's basically chained to this demon, and the demon has made her go and seduce men to get them off guard, and then the demon can come in and basically suck their feast on their bodies, eat their bodies out. And now it's too late, but he sees the demon creeping up, and you can see he's like grabbing the curtain, no, and he's dying, and the woman is just staring. What's interesting is that this is the exact opposite of women's roles typically in cinema. Women are usually the body to be looked at. They are usually powerless bodies. But in this case, the woman in this scene was active. She's the empowered one, and she actually forces the male into a passive, powerless state. Very interesting, right? And typically in cinema, this is kind of widely seen in Hollywood cinema, and in genre films especially. Every single time that we see a woman, she's going to be passive. She's going to be a body that is to be looked at. But in this case, this is a body with great power. This is a weaponized body. Now, at the same time, she is sexualized. She is erotic. She is a temptress. But it is interesting to consider that her body plays an incredibly important role in seducing this man, and it is made active, while in typical genre films, bodies are passive. And that's how, for instance, in pornography, that's how the body genre works. Because women are so passive, then that is how the excess happens, right? Women are passive, and then they let themselves kind of be sexually dominated, and then that's how gratification is given to the spectator. In this case, though, it's an erotic scene, but tables have been turned, and it is now the male body that is powerless and decimated even. Furthermore, when we think about a body, we're not just talking about the biological body. We're not just talking about like human anatomy. We're actually talking about the biological body, human anatomy, as society and culture and views it. So we're talking about the body and culture, right? So how human bodies, not the meaning implicit in just biology, but how that meaning actually morphs when we're in culture. And the basic definition of that is gender. So we have sex, or the sex of a person is their biological body, right? And that is tied to their biological body. That defines kind of their sex characteristics biologically. But what gender you are is then how your body is understood in culture and in society. So, for instance, you can be a certain sex, but choose to portray yourself as a certain gender. And regardless of what your sex is, your gender is how you position your body in culture and in society. So in that sense, body and gender are inextricably tied and effectively one and the same. Because, if you think about it, how do you define body, right? How do you, if you wanted to define yourself with your body, how would you do it? Well, you might use lipstick, you might use eyeliner, you might put clothes on your body, you might wear a watch, might wear glasses. And these would define your body, how your body would be read. And so if you wear glasses, then someone would look at your body and say, oh, uh, maybe that means they're smart. But notice how each of those is gendered. Glasses are gendered. Clothing is gendered. Lipstick, only it's just lipstick is gendered so that women should be using lipstick. That lipstick is a female thing, and so thus all of these things are gender. The body is gender. That's the first and foremost thing. That's how you define a body, is through gender. That's why Judith Butler calls it gender performance, because how you define your gender is what you actually do to your body. It's not your body biologically, but it's what you do to your body. And thus, you're actively putting on clothes, you're putting on lipstick. It's a performance. So it makes it all the more interesting then that we already have effectively a body interaction with this mechanic of how the women in this film are kind of actively being powerful or using their power over men, and kind of tables are turned there. So already we get this interaction with body. Well, even more, we get this character, which is a direct confrontation with bodies through gender. She, he, they, it, I don't really know what to call them, because they are a mix between genders. So this is, like I said, that the woman in that the previous shots, she was a ghost, and she was serving this demon, right? That this demon monster. Well, this is a demon, and so she has basically enslaved a bunch of different ghost girls to go and seduce women for them, and they then feast on their bodies. But they, or it, or whatever, has to appropriate the Judith Butler book name, gender trouble. Well, actually, both gender trouble and body trouble. With give it out, gender body are linked, because they can't seem to really figure out if they're a man, a woman, or neither. Their gender is undefined, and you can see this in that they look male in many ways, but they're wearing lipstick. And so what's interesting is also that this is reflected in the audio, where their dialogue is actually dubbed by two different actors. And one actor is male and uses a very strong, like, gruff male voice, and then the other is female and uses a shrill female voice. And they basically, every line they switch. So halfway through the line, it switches gender again, switches gender again. And so this person is basically, or this demon, I should say, I guess, is basically doing the ultimate confrontation with body, the ultimate gender performance. And they're just flitting back and forth and can't really decide where they fit. So how fitting and how surprisingly profound. This seems, a Chinese ghost story seems like just a really fun, funny, scary, sexy movie, but it's surprisingly interesting in how it confronts all these different areas of genre, and then understanding genre as a body genre, then it confronts body, and then gender. As for what exactly it has to say about gender, I really don't know myself. It's just baffling because it's hard to decipher this film given how incredibly frenetic it is. But it's such a fun movie. It's, like I said, it's funny, it's exciting with and it's high octane with the action. It basically appeals to everyone, no matter if you like horror or comedy or romance or action. It has something for everyone, which is the commercial benefit, at least the practical commercial benefit of this particular strategy. So with that, that's all I have today. Thank you so much for listening in on this talk, and I hope you enjoy The Phantom Carriage and A Chinese Ghost Story.